Listen up. Early August 2024, dawn breaks. A Russian logistics convoy pushes through the Kursk sector under what looks like heavy, ironclad protection. Less than 15 minutes later, that entire column is wiped out. No heavy artillery barrages, no manned strike aircraft overhead, absolutely zero warning visible from the ground level. What hits them is fast, dead quiet, and surgically precise. Transport vehicles burn, heavy ammo detonates, and air defense batteries go dark, one by one. In modern combat, a tactical collapse usually requires days of sustained kinetic pressure. This massacre takes minutes. What just went down near Kursk is not a random strike or some lucky shot. It is a deliberate, highly structured, and ruthlessly timed execution. It raises a massive red flag for every modern military command currently monitoring this brutal war. How does a heavily shielded grid fail this completely, this fast? You and I are unpacking a warning. It is a grim wake-up call. The strike zeroes in on a Russian supply convoy pushing through the Kursk sector, a zone completely exposed as intense frontline fighting pushes violently toward the Russian border. Crucial supply. Corridors there now sit right in the kill zone of Ukrainian strike drones launching from deeper, secured positions. These columns do not haul armor or frontline infantry, but they absolutely dictate how long those tanks roll and artillery batteries fire, because diesel and high-explosive shells are the actual backbone of any sustained offensive. In modern warfare, a unit without resupply makes no heroic retreat. It bleeds out, then dies. By mid-2024, Russian top brass clearly recognizes this critical vulnerability. Rear echelon logistics can no longer freely roll like they used to, lightly defended and out of mind. These convoys are now heavily treated as mobile high-value targets, shielded by escorts that look like frontline combat units instead of rear support columns. This tactical shift comes from brutal lessons. Earlier drone swarms annihilated unprotected fuel tankers miles behind the DUP's zero line, triggering emergency resupply panics and exposing massive strategic flaws. Here in Kursk, the protection followed a layered defense doctrine that looks impenetrable on briefing maps. Let us break it down. The outer layer leans on radar-guided, short-range air defense platforms engineered to track and destroy incoming hostiles long before they hit the convoy, especially incoming threats diving from medium altitudes. These combat systems are built to react fast, track multiple bogies, and fire interceptors in seconds, making them highly effective against strike jets, helicopters, and heavy drone systems. Deploying them signaled absolute confidence that any inbound drone swarm gets painted early and vaporized at standoff range. The inner defense layer relied strictly on infrared-guided anti-air systems, set up as a close-in failsafe rather than the primary shield. These weapons do not ping active radar. They hunt thermal signatures, making them incredibly deadly against hostile targets that dive beneath the radar net or skim the deck at ultra-low altitudes. Tactically speaking, this combination creates an overlapping kill web. One system covers the other's blind spots, while operators maintain maximum situational awareness, responding in organized sequence instead of pure chaos. This setup is no accident. It reflects months of brutal battlefield adaptation. Russian commanders learned the hard way that solo units fail fast, while layered grids can take a punch and still dominate. Shielding supply runs with dual detection methods is designed to force strike teams into fatal choices. Either you expose your drones to high-altitude radar, or you risk intense infrared engagement down in the dirt. Defensively speaking, this convoy looked locked and ready, but here is the critical flaw. This armored umbrella was built on a massive assumption about how the enemy operates. They assumed Ukrainian drones would strike via standard vectors, at predictable altitudes, and in familiar swarm sizes, because most past engagements fit that exact profile. Command also wrongly assumed their air defense batteries would get adequate time to fire in sequence, rather than getting utterly swarmed simultaneously. These tactical assumptions were not careless. They came from hard-won experience. But out here, that past experience just became a fatal trap. Each defensive tier was lethal on its own, but their synergy relied heavily on predictable engagement timing, distance. The radar crews fully expected to spot bogeys first. Infrared gunners planned to mop up later. Both assumed they had a safe window to track, lock, and kill. When that timeline holds, layered defenses are unbreakable. When it shatters, those layers instantly collapse into blind panic instead of coordinated protection. In Kursk, this column pushed forward like the rear sector still played by the old rules, outdated combat rules, where defenders had time and threats were obvious. I see escort systems purely prepped for a familiar kind of danger, not this radical new playbook. Sure, they were guarding vehicles, but more importantly, they were guarding an obsolete concept of warfare. Today, you and I are watching that concept shatter, long before any truck took a hit or exploded. What developed next wasn't a kinetic strike on the, quote, convoy itself. It was a surgical takedown of their defensive logic. This escalating operation kicked off with a tactic that initially looks foolish. Breaking all standard doctrine, these Ukrainian FPV drones didn't fly low like operators usually expect. Instead, they aggressively climbed into wide-open airspace, fully exposed. I can report, these drones weren't launched to destroy transport vehicles or blast air defenses. They were never meant to survive the sortie, because their brutal, single-minded mission was to be completely visible. By flying high, they painted huge targets on their backs and forced defenders to react on Ukrainian time. Make no mistake, raw visibility was the primary weapon in this phase, because radar systems like the Tor M2 are strictly programmed to snap fire the second a target hits the screen. The absolute second those drones crossed into detection range, the Russian system functioned exactly as engineered. Radar tracks locked, threat symbols flashed, and interceptor missiles fired in rapid succession. Inside that cabin, the Russian crew probably felt pretty cocky. Every single launch confirmed their gear was tracking and responding perfectly. To anyone watching, this looked like a flawless, textbook air defense, with technology doing exactly what the brochure promised. But listen closely. Radar defense is never an unbreakable wall, even if it looks that way from the trenches. After every kinetic engagement, the computer system absolutely must crunch the data, reset its tracking priorities, and sweep the sky to see what's left flying. This reboot cycle takes seconds, but those seconds are hardwired by physics and software totally out of the crew's control. On a quiet front line, that brief pause means nothing, because no one is rushing to exploit it. But in this highly coordinated strike, that pause kicks the door wide open. Missile launches matter in another, critical way. Every single interceptor fired is an irreversible battlefield decision. Short-range air defense missiles might be highly lethal, but their ammo is extremely limited. Reloading demands time and deadly exposure. By deliberately drawing fire early, the Ukrainian forces weren't just creating a massive radar blind spot, they were gutting the Ponda. Russian defenders' tactical options. Every precious missile wasted on high-flying bait meant one less interceptor ready for an incoming, blistering fast threat. Now stick with me here, this phase wasn't about blowing up the radar, and it wasn't about swarming it with massive numbers. This was pure, brutal timing. As the Tor M2 engaged those visible decoy drones, its processing power hyper-focused on obvious targets. Everything else out there violently faded into the background. The instant that final missile cleared the launch tubes, the system dropped into its routine reset cycle, completely confident it had neutralized the threat. But for one terrifying, brief window, that air defense radar went practically blind. It wasn't jammed, hacked, or glitched out. It was just overwhelmed computing data, because even modern military sensors cannot look everywhere with perfect clarity. During that split-second window, detection quality degraded just enough to be fatal. Technically, the airspace didn't go completely black. But tactically, it became chaotic. And battlefield uncertainty is exactly where these planned killer drone strikes thrive. It's incredibly easy to overlook this moment if you just picture warfare as a non-stop Hollywood firefight. In grim reality, modern combat pivots entirely on microscopic gaps created by automated systems doing exactly what the engineers designed them to do. Honestly, the Tor M2 didn't break down in any traditional sense. It reacted, launched, and survived the initial contact. The fatal flaw was their deeply held assumption that firing equals airspace control. What made this phase so devastating was the cold discipline of the attackers. The strike drones didn't blindly rush forward when the first missiles launched. They hovered, waiting for the system's reset cycle, because bleeding the clock a few seconds boosted their kill probability way more than raw speed ever could. Tactical patience is significantly harder to maintain than aggression, especially in high-stakes drone warfare where operators always itch to push the throttle the second anti-air fires. But when the Russian radar finally initiated its next scan, the aerial battlefield had violently shifted. The sacrificial bait was completely gone, either blown to pieces or retreating out of range, and the real, lethal threat was nowhere near where the targeting computer expected it to be. So what do you and I learn here? The defense fought the last problem, while attackers already rigged the next. Let's review the tactical map. Phase 1 didn't end with a massive strike, but with a silent, lethal shift in battlefield advantage. The air defense crews thought the skies were clear, but the enemy just swept the lane. That critical blind spot was exactly what hostile forces needed to drop altitude, pivot, and seal the outcome. Phase 2 initiated in dead silence. Right as the early warning radar cycled its reset, a fresh drone swarm pushed in right on the deck, hugging the dirt tight enough that pure speed and stealth profiles became totally irrelevant. These suicide drones weren't pushing thrusters to beat tracking systems or using advanced countermeasures. They banked on something bulletproof, basic physics, and the hard force and limits of optical sensors. By scraping the ground, they slipped into a dead zone where radar fails by absolute design. Look, radar nets push out energy pulses and catch the bounce, but those radio waves punch in straight lines and they do not curve. Hills, tree canopies, urban structures, even minor terrain dips physically break the line of sight. That creates geographic blind spots no software patch can fix. When hostile drones skim 3 meters off the deck, they vanish into heavy ground clutter. The massive radar bounce off the earth completely washes out the faint signatures of tiny targets. Down in the mud, size dictates survival, and kamikaze drones simply evaporate into background noise. This brutal tactic didn't need electronic warfare masking or high-tech jamming, which is exactly why air defenders couldn't kill it. We saw zero jamming spikes, no cyber intrusions to trace, simply because the hostile swarm bypassed the primary radar grid altogether. They just navigated through terrain pockets. The ground sensors were never engineered to scan. Down in the command bunker, there was zero warning siren, no solid hostile track, just mounting anxiety as the airspace above stayed completely silent, even as the drone threat closed the gap. When the primary dish finished its next sweep, the tactical picture had collapsed. The kamikaze birds weren't just inbound from the high-altitude intercept zones. They had penetrated deep inside the terminal defense perimeter, a sector where time evaporates and engagement options vanish. At this lethal proximity, radar locking is practically impossible. Contacts pop up violently and close, erasing any window for a coordinated firing solution. Our early warning nets weren't technically blind, but they were severely late, and in modern air, defense, late equals dead. That lag forced a panic handoff to short-range point defense, a layer which was deployed as a final failsafe, not the primary shield. Heat-seeking surface-to-air systems are engineered to snap engage at knife-fight ranges, tracking thermal blooms instead of radar bounce. They usually shred leakers that slip past long-range interceptors, but they are completely overwhelmed by massive waves of rapid, inbound contacts all at once, especially when the swarm is microscopic and attacks from 360. Now you and I need to note the pivot here. It wasn't when hostiles crossed a specific grid line, but when the threat handover dumped from one weapon system to another, completely unannounced. Radar operators lacked the vital seconds to vector or cue the infrared gunners. The kill box simply collapsed way too fast. Our integrated air defense broke into isolated panic fire. Every weapon station fought completely blind and alone instead of operating as one. Unified combat net. This brutal drone tactic weaponized human psychology just as hard as hardware limits. Our troops are drilled to react to hard alarms and flashing tracks, not dead silence. The absolute lack of telemetry data heavily paralyzes. A commander's call, even with hostiles close. In that fatal hesitation, seconds burned out. Without target lock, while the enemy birds pushed hard at attack speed, completely immune to base panic. The sheer brilliance of this assault was its cold restraint, not brute force. The swarm didn't burn altitude to draw fire, and they didn't break formation blindly. They hugged the dirt, stayed absolutely masked, and stayed lethal and patient. Buying just a few extra seconds of survival outweighed maximum velocity. By executing that, they collapsed the entire battle space from a wide Overwatch grid into a brutal knife fight where our troops had to return fire in milliseconds or die trying. The second that early warning radar dropped, the whole nature of this combat fundamentally shifted. What started as a scanning issue became a terrifying reaction drill, and reaction combat always favors the enemy choosing the exact second of impact. Securing that armor column was no longer about early intel, but purely about last-ditch terminal defense. That is the most chaotic and least survivable tactic in modern warfare. We're seeing a maneuver that dumped the entire combat burden onto point defense systems built for a completely different war. Listen to this combat update. Phase 3 shattered their infrared defenses. The Strela-10 hunts heat, not radar signatures. That's solid against attack choppers, but it rapidly breaks down when multiple small kamikaze drones rush in close. Thermal optics hunt contrast, not shape, and small strike drones push out. A much weaker, unstable thermal signature compared to large aircraft. Against a single incoming hostile, the rig gets a solid lock. Hit it with a swarm, though, and it splits focus. That split costs time. Initially, the perimeter actually held. We saw multiple hostile drones get splashed, right as they breached the kill zone. This told us the hardware was fully operational and the battery crew was staying frosty under heavy fire. But every single confirmed kill demanded a brutal step-by-step kill chain from Eversent. Radar paint, to thermal lock, to missile off the rail. Rush that sequence, and your missile goes wide. Radar arrays can juggle multiple threats simultaneously, but these heat-seeking setups are severely bottlenecked by relying on manual targeting and human operators. As a wave of hostiles pushed in from varying vectors and elevations, the prosant Strela-10 got massively saturated. Every fresh blip on the board demanded an immediate reaction, but human bandwidth maxes out fast, especially against tiny, high-speed threats pouring in mere seconds apart. The platform wasn't just crushed by pure volume, but by sheer timing. Multiple strike birds breached the kill box at the exact same time. In this combat space, a half-second delay turns a lockdown sector into complete overload. This exactly exposes the tactical limits of thermal defense systems. This hardware was built to mop up solitary leakers that dodge radar, not to repel a coordinated, close-quarters drone swarm. These platforms are designed as the absolute last line of defense, never the primary shield. Force them onto the front lines, and they crack. The Strela-10 threw everything it had, but it simply couldn't shoot at everything at once. And then, one hostile bird shifted its vector. Instead of hunting the supply trucks, it banked hard directly toward the anti-air unit, taking a deliberate kamikaze dive. Make no mistake, this wasn't panic. This was a cold, calculated tactical decision driven entirely by combat priorities. Wiping out the final active anti-air battery was infinitely more valuable than crippling another transport rig. Once the umbrella drops, the whole convoy is sitting ducks. The execution timing was just as critical as the target itself. The munitions slammed the Strela-10 right mid-maneuver, absolutely gutting its tracking ability. Shifting gears on the move throws off sensor alignment, severely alters targeting angles, and massively spikes the crew's stress load, shrinking the kill window to zero. Within seconds, the weapon system was knocked offline, and the entire defensive umbrella instantly collapsed. From that single, catastrophic detonation, the total reality of this combat zone completely flipped. The armored column had zero layered defenses left, no backup coverage whatsoever, totally naked. Our feeds show no secondary thermal units moving up, and absolutely zero radar sites in position to lock down this close-quarters airspace. The heavy escorts got completely neutralized, not through overwhelming firepower, but through ruthless target prioritization and timing. Let's step back. We are watching a brutal lesson in modern warfare. An air defense grid doesn't just fail when a launcher gets vaporized. It utterly collapses when you force it into a tactical role it wasn't built for. That Strela 10 held the line until it was pushed to fight too fast against way too many hostiles pouring in at once. And listen, this glaring vulnerability isn't just tied to this exact rig. It's a deadly reality for almost any legacy anti-air hardware out there. Now, knocking out that thermal unit didn't trigger some massive cinematic fireball you could see for miles, but tactically, it was checkmate. Without it, the column lost its absolute last layer of armor. The remaining strike birds faced zero organized resistance. What we're looking at next wasn't a firefight between two military forces. It was just a methodical, clinical execution of completely defenseless heavy vehicles. In that blistering exchange, the defending battalion didn't just lose a launch vehicle. They lost total control of the engagement. The hostile operators instantly secured total airspace dominance, priority target selection, and absolute battlefield tempo. The second those tactical advantages flip, a total wipeout becomes mathematically inevitable, no matter how many boots remain grounded. With the escorts completely erased, the assault shifted to the actual target. This final phase played out with chilling precision, because the second that protective umbrella dropped, 9 remaining strike drones pushed straight through uncontested and started prosecuting targets with absolute priority instead of frantic urgency. Nobody was rushing to just blow up the closest vehicle. Instead, the attackers had dead time to pick out the highest value targets. This wasn't about simply breaking through. This was a calculated strike designed for absolute maximum devastation. They nailed the fuel tankers first. Fuel is highly volatile, and once it catches, that destruction spreads fast. The blast easily wiped out nearby rigs. As that first tanker blew, a massive heat wave ripped across the convoy, cooking off surrounding transport trucks that hadn't even taken a direct hit. Fire kills, sure, but extreme heat is far worse. It melts steel, cooks off payload, and transforms a clean hit into an absolute nightmare scenario. One hit guaranteed total carnage. They slammed into the ammo carriers next. They waited for the flames to spread. High explosives cook off brutally under intense, sustained heat. Secondary blasts ripped through the tight convoy, turning the column into scrap metal. 0 direct hits required. Every blast multiplied the damage, ripping the formation into one massive chain reaction. This wasn't isolated damage. In this hell, perfectly good rigs were left dead as panicking crews bailed out. The escape routes jammed up. Speed was just as lethal as the warheads here. The kill chain executed so fast that nobody could counter it. From initial radar ping to the last fireball, roughly 12 minutes, ticked by. That is no time for backup to push up or survivors to form a defense. By the 12-minute mark, at least a dozen transport trucks were totally smoked. The entire supply column ceased to function on the battlefield. Those critical supplies didn't just get delayed, they were wiped off the map. This isn't just for show or morale. That massive crater carries heavy tactical consequences right now. Combat units relying on that gear faced brutal realities. Halt their assault, restrict gas, or hold tight until new routes clear. Shifting roads burns daylight and opens fresh vulnerabilities. Fighting with starved supply lines breaks down men and machines alike. Even a minor delay totally shatters their tightly packed battle rhythm. This assault triggered a brutal shockwave far past the burning metal. It forced command to rethink safety miles off the front. Rear supply hubs are supposed to stay quiet. They shouldn't scream for help during a firefight. Once rear lines take hits like this, generals panic. Attention pulls off the front line, forced onto guard duty tasks they previously ignored. That hidden tax destroys armies much faster than blown-up trucks. This wasn't blind rage, it was cold discipline. The drone operators didn't go chasing the hot note, random movement, or act on impulse. They executed a strict kill list built to paralyze the unit, not just dent armor. Before the final warheads dropped, the column was shattered. No lone surviving truck was going to save that mission. Stick with me here. This bloodbath reveals a massive truth about modern warfare. The slaughter near Kursk wasn't just one unlucky column catching fire. It exposed a brutal tactical shift that heavily punishes Russian armor on today's battlefield. Inside 12 minutes, dirt-cheap FPV drones, flown with lethal timing, completely shredded defense grids that cost millions and took years to construct. This wasn't about old Russian tech failing. Those systems got pushed into blind spots forced by physics, operator fatigue, and rigid tactics. Today, victory doesn't belong to the army with the heaviest gear. It goes to the fighter who knows exactly how those systems crack under stress. The rear echelon is a kill zone now. Armor means nothing. For Russian forces, every vital logistics road is a bloody front line, and dropping your guard means death. If you and I want hard truth on how modern combat actually works, subscribe to Military Force. Lock in and wait for my next tactical briefing.